I'm Claire Withers from the University of Pittsburgh, and my colleagues and I will be presenting about the toolkit that we've developed. And let's see, what else can I tell you? I am a curator in archives and special collections. Diana, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Diana Dill, and I'm also from the University of Pittsburgh Library System. And I've worked as both an instructional designer and assessment specialist with the Assessment and Quality Assurance Department of the library.
Okay.
And I'm Kirsten Payne. I am an interpretive specialist at the Rivers of Steel Heritage Corporation, and I am also found in the English department as a part-time instructor at the University of Pittsburgh.
Okay, so now you know a bit more about us. On this slide. You can read a bit more about the organizations that we're with, and you'll be hearing a little bit more too as we go on. So we're going to be talking about a primary source literacy toolkit developed by a team at Pitt. And we're really going to give you a little bit of background, talking about the flexibility, the origin of it, and examples. And we'll also close with a look at how easy assessment can be. The toolkit maps to the guidelines, and it's all about streamlining from planning to delivery to assessment of primary source engagements. And we'll also quickly break down how it facilitates conversation, design, and integration of materials into teaching and learning. Okay, so in 2019, Diana and I and two other colleagues from our respective units, we joined an ARL RLIF project that was exploring how the library's special collections support primary source learning. And a goal for all the participants in this project was the creation of some kind of flexible tool. Our team quickly agreed that we wanted to map to the RBMS SAA primary source literacy guidelines. And we wanted to create, really, if we could, an elegant tool that was about planning, delivery, and assessment. And we also envisioned using this tool to quickly convey primary source literacy concepts to non-librarians. And as if that wasn't enough, we thought we could do this and we could fit it into something manageable, something like a double-sided sheet of paper. So we worked and we worked, and nothing was resonating. It was pretty unwieldy. So we decided to take a break working as a group. We worked individually. And when we reconvened, it turned out that all of us had come to the same conclusion. We employed a rubric and we scaffolded. And when we compared notes, we were pretty much, doing the same thing. And we found that some things, like you can see in this example, they scaffolded beautifully, like A, B, C, and D. For a concept, and in some cases not so much, but we quickly put that all together. And I think in the chat, Diana's going to share a link to the actual toolkit. We'll be showing you pieces of it, but if you want to have a look at it. Then once we had that part done and it was a double-sided sheet, we added a lesson plan. And in our unit, we always begin a consultation by asking the instructor, what are your learning goals? And so we just formalized that. And we wanted to be flexible. So, there could be one goal, there could be multiple sessions, but no more than, say, 3 sessions tops. And even that, it just kind of depended on the situation. So in the RLIF focus groups and interviews that were part of what we did, we had 2 things that were absolutely clear. The first thing was that all the instructors cited the wow factor as the chief aim of coming to visit. And, we found this out because we showed them the guidelines in the initial format and the rubric, and we said, is there anything missing? And they all told us that, and we were kind of surprised because it wasn't on our radar. We knew it was important, but we didn't think we needed to articulate it. The other thing was that there was a real split on rubrics, and there were people who ran toward them and people who ran away from them. And the people who valued them, a lot of times they came from an education background. The ones who did not like them really thought it was interjecting a formal schema on top of the learning process, and they really didn't think it was a good thing. But in this slide, they said, I just want them to turn a page. One of the people who said that then, and really was anti-rubric, looked at this and started pointing and saying, oh yeah, but when we come, we do this and we do this and we do this. And so it turns out that this rubric opened up the discussion in that instance. So I use the toolkit overtly or sub rosa, depending on the situation. It often is an incremental process, and it's all about me demonstrating the contribution to the instructor's success, and that strengthens the relationship. And so, over time, making some headway there in really being a full collaborator. So for instance, if I'm working with an instructor for the first time, I'll say, what are your learning goals? And I'll have the toolkit handy, and not maybe use it outright unless I really know the person otherwise. And whatever I hear from them, I'm going to translate that language into guideline speak using the rubric, and ID the block on the grid. And that really allows me to quickly get a handle on it and understand, is this a beginning competency or intermediate, or is this really advanced? And then I can just switch back to that instructor language and have a conversation about it. And about like what the engagement piece will be. So here's a quick example. So pretty recently there was an instructor, and they were scheduled for one visit, and his learning goals ranged from basic to several advanced concepts. And I was able to say, that first goal is really basic. Why don't we do this and this? And we talked about the materials that would speak to it and what we would do. And then I said, this goal is really pretty complex, because it's this and it's this and it's really about this too, right? And so we talked, and then I said, and before we figure things out, these other things that you talked about, like this is complex too, right? Because we're asking students to do this and this and this. And I also relied on the rubric to let me look at the intermediate and the basic goals in those same areas. Because it was important that we didn't just jump over to the complex without achieving those. And so it really let us efficiently and economically have a conversation about skill building to get to what is most important. And so we discussed, we refined, and then before very long at all, the instructor said, I should come at least 2 times. And I said, yeah, that would be a really good thing. And so we focused it and we scaffolded it. And, I mentioned how we always in our unit say, what are your learning goals? One of the other things that we do is, at a minimum, we really recommend the use of prompts or guiding questions. And it's moving away from, we just want them to look and absorb and see what they think, because, it's not growing their skills, we think, as much as having some guidance there. And so there, in this case, there was resistance. And the instructor, though, we had already talked about a lot of things, and they said, well, this is clearly pretty important to you. So sure, just go ahead. If you want to make some handouts, that's great. I don't think that they had really high hopes for that, but that's all right. What happened is that we did the sessions, and it went really, really well. And the instructor was pleased. And so the next time that class was taught, he scheduled 2 visits right off the bat. He had some really clear ideas of what he wanted to do. And he said, oh, and for the questions, when we do the questions, why don't I just, I'll work on those myself. So we had just, jumped that hurdle. Another example is an instructor who really liked the idea of rubrics, requested a copy for herself. And she went back to an earlier, like pre all this research class from a year or 2 back. And she came to me later and she said, there in the questions, I had added one because I wanted the students to do, and it was some specific thing. And she said, I was really disappointed because they just didn't get it. She said, but I used the rubric and I understood that I wasn't asking them the right questions for them to be telling me, what I expected to hear. So my last example dates back from when we were actively doing the research process. So we had a cohort of undergrads, and they were doing immersive research. And we gave them our basic blog post instructions that, we always typically use. We thought those were pretty good. And we thought, okay, and we're going to use the rubric and we're going to assess this stuff, right? Because a way to do that, and you'll hear about this, but we saw evidence in it of beginning skills, but this cohort was a semester long thing. It was immersion, and we really thought we were going to see all this evidence of complex learning, and there wasn't anything visible. There was nothing. Because of the pandemic, there was funding to continue the project. So we did another cohort in another semester. But before we gave them the blog post instructions, our team revisited them, and we looked at the rubric and we looked at what we expected to hear, and we wrote the instructions so that we could tease those things out. And the difference was like night and day. One of the things that happened was that they did these incredible blog posts, but they also, there's always this subsequent presentation from this cohort where they talk about their research experience, not their findings, but the research process. And typically faculty attend this, but they only pop in to support the students that they worked with. But this time around, the students, they were so articulate, and instructors later came up to me, at so many of them, and they said, this was the best yet. This was incredible. And at least 3, if not more of them said, I only came to stay for my student, but it was so good, I couldn't leave. And to hear and see testimony like that, I think really helped us understand what was working with the rubric. So those are my examples from class visits, and I'm going to turn it over now to Kirsten to continue on.
And I have even more examples for you, and I'm actually going to talk about 3 different ways that I have incorporated this toolkit and the rubric into my own work in the classroom and my own work in an archives at a cultural heritage institution, because I really want folks to be able to see just how flexible and adaptable this toolkit is, that it doesn't matter if you are approaching it from the perspective of an instructor, like I do sometimes, or if you're approaching it from the perspective of the archives facilitator, like I do sometimes, that the toolkit works in any number of contexts, with any number of kinds of encounters, and with any number of different kinds of student projects or student work that somebody might want to get out of this process. So I kind of want to walk you through 3. And the first is actually coming from my work as a part-time instructor in the English department at Pitt, where I teach a number of different kinds of literature courses. Most of them are lower level undergraduate courses. And they range from anything to something called Literature of the Americas, to an introduction to literature, childhood's books, representing adolescence. And that's where I'd like to talk to you today, is about projects that I frequently work through in representing adolescence. Because in any one of those classes, and it doesn't matter if it is Introduction to Literature or Representing Adolescence, which is one of the required courses for the Children's Literature Certificate in the English department, it doesn't matter the course. I think spending time in special collections is a really crucial component to every single one of my courses. And because I value it as such a crucial component to my courses, I have a whole range of pedagogical goals for these visits. And it always starts with a consultation with Claire and any of the other librarians that I might work with in those courses. But most frequently, I'll work with Claire. And we've developed such a shorthand at this point that she is really a close collaborator. She's not there merely to fetch some items for my students to look at. We together have developed a number of goals that I have been able to implement for my students in the course of these visits. And the work that I can see from my students as a result of that collaboration, which is really based on, hey, we have this toolkit. Would you be interested in working with it to see what we get? So I guess I am the testimonial in this case. But some of the broader goals that I bring with my classes, yes, I want to introduce students to special collections as a valuable research resource. I want them to know that within the library system, special collections and archives exist as a tool for research. I want to introduce students to primary source research that is rooted in print and material culture. I want to introduce students to the practice of handling special collections materials. But I also want to give students frameworks for reading books or magazines or scrapbooks as physical objects, so the text beyond the text. And I also want to give students a framework for understanding publishing history as cultural production. And all of that adds this very crucial layer of connectivity to all of my assigned reading and the projects that make scaffolding projects outside of special collections much more feasible. This is all closely related to asking students to interrogate silences, gaps, or elisions in records, asking them to investigate the targeted makeup of audience, creating contextual knowledge for discussions related to their assigned reading, or even evaluating historical frameworks and the efficacy of using silences or absence or gaps as a theoretical model. So let's use representing adolescence as an example. So just as a quick background, representing adolescence in the English department at the University of Pittsburgh is a 600 level course, which generally means that it is a genre or concentration focused course that is intended to introduce students to key texts and concepts. This is taken directly from the English department guidebook. So broadly, my class tracks the emergence of US American adolescence as a cultural concept from the late 18th century through the 21st, and it considers the ways in which marginalized adolescent identities and experiences are defined via literature, which primarily for my class, it's novels, but we also examine poetry and drama and short stories. So because Claire and I have had many conversations about this particular course, and when she approached me about adapting the toolkit, I took her invitation to help articulate all of these goals beyond I want my students to look at cool things, which I do, but I want them to be able to do something with looking at those cool things. I want them to be genuinely interested in it, and I want them to also be self-motivated to reach back out to special collections to engage with them independently. So in this class, we have a reliable 7-station rotation that includes material students have read prior to their visit, things like Charlotte Temple or selections from the Lowell Offering, and material that reaches forward to what they will encounter later in the semester, things like etiquette books and magazines, comics, and most recently, a station devoted to a magazine called The Red Man, which is the literary magazine coming from the Carlisle School. The material does not need to correlate directly with the semester reading, but it instead creates this critical and theoretical framework for analysis and discussion. So it is crucial and supplementary, but it often gets folded into primary discussion of everything else that we're talking about throughout the course. Taking from our initial consultation, I have developed a worksheet of guided questions to help students navigate the primary source materials, which is what you can see on the left-hand side of that slide. You might not be able to see the questions, and I would be very happy to provide this list of questions for you because this worksheet, I think, is a pretty good flexible template that I have kind of geared towards this toolkit. I've broken things down into categories, but I ask students as they rotate through these stations, I ask them to evaluate everything that they're seeing and take notes on the physicality of objects. I ask them to describe the item's appearances and what they can learn from looking at them as primary sources. I ask them, what are the differences between types of printed materials? How are the books different from the magazines, comics, posters, or newsletters? I ask them, how are the items bound? Are they folded or are they loose? What can you tell from the way the item is physically put together? I ask them to observe the kinds of conditions that these pieces are in, the rips, the tears, the holes, the stains, the evidence of repair, or the evidence of use. I ask them to consider marketing. Marketing as in tie-ins. Are they meant to help sell a novel, a movie, or another piece of literary culture? I ask them to think about audience and who this object is for. I ask them things like, where were these things made? Do they show evidence of having been produced in a particular place? I ask them about context, what they can observe about the insight that the items give about a particular group of people or a place or a particular kind of experience. And I ask them to specifically consider the silences. What are they not seeing? What's absent from these tables? And so I use this note-taking approach, this worksheet approach, not to turn it in at the end of the class. I don't want to see their notes, but I ask them to use it as the basis for other projects. So for me, that goes into an essay topic that is devoted to special collections. It also goes into discussion board topics where we can continue the conversation outside of the classroom, but it also goes into our primary semester-long project, which is the production of a commonplace book. On the other side of this slide, you can see one of the examples of the commonplace book from a student in class last semester that was born out of our reading the Lowell Offering in class, but also our encounter with original copies of the Lowell Offering in special collections. And so for me, for a project like this to be successful, this kind of multi-pronged approach where they produce some sort of formal writing, informal writing, and semester-long continued engagement with all of the texts that they are reading, I find that I ask students to spend the equivalent of 1 week's class time in special collection, kind of depending on the schedule, depends on how many visits that is, but for me, it is the equivalent of 1 week. And the primary source material that we engage with in that 1 week, we find that 1 week maps to those 7 stations and allows us as facilitators, but also the students as the participants in the class to remain curious and engaged and ready for discussion. And they're also fully prepared to translate their special collections visit into written work. So for me, it's that allowance for a multifaceted approach to both learning and to assessment of student work that I find extremely important. And so I want to take a look at how this kind of flows into my capacity as an interpretive specialist at Rivers of Steel. At Rivers of Steel, I often serve in various instructional roles that are primarily based out of my work in our own archives. And one example of this is at the University of Pittsburgh and Rivers of Steel. We work together every couple of years to administer a National Endowment for the Humanities workshop on the 1892 Battle of Homestead and ensuing strike. So it's a very specific event. It's a very specific type of history, but this week-long workshop invites K through 12 educators, K through 12 librarians, and museum educators to learn about the battle and strike. And then we help them develop their own curriculum materials for their classrooms. And so this year I was tasked with leading a hands-on printmaking session. So we used the special collections and Pitt's text and context lab to combine 2 approaches to this primary source toolkit for instructional purposes. Digital sources. In this case, we used headlines from Pittsburgh newspapers in July of 1892, as well as the resources available in Pitt's text and context lab. This was designed to be one engagement, a single visit, and it had a time limit of 1 hour and 15 minutes. So it was actually very short. And so the goal for this session then was to design a take-home project, a 5 or 6 word newspaper headline using the 1884 Columbian Press. So period technology, setting type, inking, operating the press, and basing it on accessible primary source material. So in this case, it was the selection of newspaper headlines, and I kept it sourced as accessibly as possible through newspapers.com because I wanted the workshop participants to see ways that they could replicate this in their own classrooms. And so as the leader of this activity, I used this rubric on my own as the facilitator to identify what I needed the workshop participants to accomplish. So I needed to introduce them to the Pittsburgh media landscape in the late 19th century. I needed to guide comparative investigation and discussion of example headlines from 3 different newspapers. I needed a way to connect their discussion of media to the medium itself. And I also needed to be able to give them a way to brainstorm how an activity like the one we were doing together could be translated to K-12 resource availability while preserving the main question at hand, which was how do we, as 21st century people, read, understand, and respond to 19th century newspaper headlines. And so what we wound up with was a pretty adaptable and pretty flexible framework that I think the teachers can use going forward. And so I also wanted to talk about one final project, which was something that I engaged with fully in my own capacity as an interpretive specialist at Rivers of Steel, and as somebody who was using our own archive resources to facilitate a year-long student project with the Montour City School District in just outside of Pittsburgh. So we frequently use our archival holdings at Rivers of Steel, which involves resources connected to industrial history in southwestern Pennsylvania as the basis for our public programming. So teaching K through 12 and college and university students and museum co-workers is a key part of that. And so the basis for this project was that 2 high school teachers, one English, one history, and a K through 12 librarian, approached the historic staff at Rivers of Steel about the prospect of this year-long interdisciplinary project for 10th grade integrated studies students. And this course is project-based. It does not use testing as a means of assessment, and students then are assessed on a number of skills, which include research, critical thinking and analysis, synthesizing information, and creative problem solving. And so the teaching team approached my director with this idea of creating children's books that tell the story of Nikita Khrushchev's 1959 visit to Pittsburgh. It's really specific, but we enthusiastically agreed to take this on and serve as advisors and provide as much support as they needed. And eventually I became the kind of primary contact person for this project. They came to our locations twice, once on a guided tour of the Cary blast furnaces and once to our offices in Homestead to learn how to research with archival materials. And so for their initial visit, a colleague and I evaluated the teacher's goals for the visit and curated the selection of materials to visit their needs. So then we identified and pulled archival materials related to Khrushchev's visit to Pittsburgh, his tour of Mesta Metal, Pittsburgh in the 1950s, and the history of Mesta Metal. And during this visit, students learned what are archives, what do they hold, and how to use them. How do you take notes on primary and secondary sources? How do you read and analyze historic photographs? And how do you read and analyze historic newspapers? And so on subsequent visits with Montour, which was a mixture of in-class visits and Zoom sessions, we realized that the students also needed to learn how to find and use primary sources for indirect context. And then I was able to provide materials from our archives using the rubric and using the toolkit that included information about unions in the 1950s, pins, tags, stickers, and other ephemera from the period to enhance their own understanding of what is mid-20th century material culture and to learn how to define what material culture is. I provided them materials about various women's clubs at the University of Pittsburgh in the 1950s, about communism and other objects as they decided that they needed them. And so what I cannot emphasize enough here is the high-level work that the 10th grade students were completing because of their continued access to targeted archival sources and their sustained support throughout the research process, which included story drafting and editing and individual consultations with student groups throughout the school year. And so what they wound up producing are 3 completely different children's books that are pictured. And so next year, I'm going to be working with these same teachers again on a new project. And I approached one of our colleagues about using the rubric overtly during our initial consultations and the development of the project. And I will say that the teachers are extremely excited to incorporate this into their own pedagogical methods. And so it's something that I think is, it's something that is so flexible and so adaptable that it is a toolkit that I will be using as the basis for pretty much all of my projects going forward.
And these are actually the books that Kirsten was talking about. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about assessment. And as you've been hearing, there are a variety of assessment options. The rubric can be used formally to assess assignments, but can it also be used informally to help us determine if the student is achieving the knowledge set out in the learning objectives. As we prepare engagements for students visiting archives and special collections, we hope to see signs of critical thinking from the students. Sometimes the informal assessment can be as simple as listening to a discussion during the class and making tick marks as we hear evidence of the student achieving the learning goal, or we may be more formally involved by gaining access to the student's assignments from the instructor. This is one of the things that Claire mentioned earlier. Using the rubric can also help librarians and instructors to assess their own performance. If your goal is for the students to situate the primary source in context, and if you notice that the majority of students appear to struggle, it might mean that your explanations didn't hit the mark. And you may need to evaluate what you explained or provided to see what you may need to do to improve the student's ability to achieve the goal and that activity. As Claire mentioned earlier, we learned that with our blog post assignment, and we had a cohort of those advanced undergraduate researchers that were working with primary sources. And as Claire mentioned, they were advanced researchers, even though undergraduate. So we expected to see certain markings from them, that they should actually hit certain marks. The assignment we provided them is illustrated on the left side of the slide. When we went to assess skill attainment, we were having trouble identifying that students were achieving the goal. That caused us to look at our prompt. The blog assignment that we gave them was generic and didn't map to the guidelines or a rubric. So we then revisited that prompt and we explicitly called out both our expectations in clear, direct language and the connection to the guidelines. And that's what you can see on the right-hand side. You can see that we actually call out the guidelines with the learning goals. Remember, assessment is not just how well students learn, but also in how well we present the information and link to our learning goals. And I will be providing a link. I haven't been able to get to chat, but I will provide a link to our primary source toolkit as soon as I stop sharing my screen. And that brings us to where we're at now, sharing a TPS in a community of practice. Go ahead, Claire.
Okay, let me just catch up a bit. I've been looking in the chat and I just want to say that we will give you the link. I've put it in a couple of times for our primary source toolkit. And there's another toolkit that we are aware of that is also taking the guidelines and scaffolding it, making it into a rubric. And so I think it was around that same time period, right? So people were grappling. And so I think it's an example of great minds think alike, and people who were really immersed in working with primary sources. We were focusing in our group on class visits and outreach type things. And I think that the other toolkit that if you look through the chat, you can find a link to was looking at bigger picture, like over the course of 4 years, how can you use the rubric? So, or the rubric idea. So it's not the exact same rubric, but anyway, it's worth noting all of that. So beyond that, I think we are about ready to head to the chat, see what questions you have. I know we have some questions for people too. We see where a lot of you are from, and that's really great. One of the things, because well, let me open it up and see if anybody has questions.